might measure, so we're going up in substrate concentrations, you might get values, and then you basically have to fit a line with those values. Now this is a hyperbolic response, and so you don't really, eyeball it. What you have to do, now here's, what I'm going to do is present something. I'm going to present a graphical way of figuring out Km, and for those of you who are in 162, you probably already did this, you might have done it in 142 as well. But the reality is the graphical way, the double reciprocal plot, which I'll show you in just a second, is a lousy way of doing it. Nobody does it anymore. The way you really do it is you use nonlinear regression analysis. And there's a bunch of programs available online. You get standalone programs. NSpitter was the one that I used to use. You say, this is the function, you put in, this is the function that I want, put in your data, and it fits the line to figure out what your K-cat and Km are and all that sort of stuff. Okay? And that's the more sophisticated way of doing it. But there's a graphical technique of doing it, which nobody uses anymore, but it's so ingrained in the field that it's like a rite of passage, this double reciprocal plot. And I would drop it because it's like teaching you guys how to use a slide rule or something like that. But you'll see it like particularly standardizing, your GRE or any of these sorts of things. The ACS exam, you'll take the next one that will have something on there. Basically, I don't have the courage to totally drop it because you might need it at some point. So we'll go through this sort of silly exercise. But it's kind of fun. It's so what's the graphical technique to figure out is to not plot directly the substrate concentration versus the initial velocity, but to do a double reciprocal plot. This is also known as a Lineweaver-Burke plot. And when you take plot 1 over B0 relative to 1 over S. And when you do that, you linearize the function. So now, when you plot it, you're going to get a line. When you get this line, now you can use linear regression to fit this line. The way it works out, this intercept here is 1 over B max. Do you do enzyme kinetics and enzyme kinetics? It may be, I'm not exactly sure what you do in 1B. Then this becomes minus 1 over Km. Now, why is this a lousy way of doing it? And it's operationally, it's that, so notice that these values down here have high substrate concentration and high V0, right? Because this is inverse, so the lower you get with V0, with 1 over V0, it means V0 is actually higher. So these values down here, these are also going to be your most reliable values because you're not trying to measure out very tiny amounts of substrate, and when you're actually measuring the activity, measuring the product form, there's plenty of it there. So these have high accuracy. These values out here have low V0, low substrate concentration, low initial velocity, and these are your less accurate. I'm trying to remember what you do in 162. You have some sort of spectrophotometric analysis, right? It's like the yellow color, I can't remember the weak-term acid phosphatase that we use, and they're kind of measuring the amount of yellow color. When you have the really low substrate, and then your absorbance values are really low and they're variable and that sort of thing. So the error out here is very high, and the error down here is relatively low. Now, what drives your linear regression here is what's going on out here. So these values out here, the ones that you actually have the least confidence in, those are the ones that are really establishing your slope and stuff and all of that. Okay. What the nonlinear regression does is it actually equalizes the error throughout the whole thing. So that's why the nonlinear regression is actually better than the one other thing I should mention is the slope of this equals Km over here. All right. So I believe in the homework you'll have a problem that you have to do this, and that you have to do this. I know in 162 you end up doing this. So you get some experience doing this. But I just wanted to be kind of open and upfront about the limitation and the fact that it's really kind of an archaic method. But you're going to see it over and over. And when we get into inhibitors, we'll talk about it. That's what we're going to talk about now, inhibitors. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is enzyme inhibition. I'm just going to start a new outline here, even though I think it's part of the same chapter. All right. Enzyme inhibition, we've got to talk a little bit about the importance. It's big business. And the reason it's big business is a lot, if not most, drugs are actually enzyme inhibitors. You find an enzyme involved in a disease process, and you try to inhibit that enzyme. Maybe it's think of antibiotics. Maybe it's an enzyme that is unique to bacteria, and so that if you want to find some antibacterial medication, then you develop an inhibitor that inhibits that enzyme that's unique to bacteria, and then doesn't affect any enzymes in humans. And so now you have a specific compound that'll kill bacteria without killing humans. Other examples are think AIDS drugs, for example, which are part of the AIDS life cycle is a reverse transcriptase step, where you basically take an RNA molecule and you convert it back to DNA. And there's a viral enzyme that accomplishes this. And so if you can find, well, what has been developed is inhibitors of this reverse transcriptase. Similarly, basically there's a process in the maturation of the virus that requires a specific protease cleavage, and there's a viral protease. And so if you can inhibit that protease, you can basically have solid antiviral drugs. And so those are the sorts of things that have been developed. So understanding enzyme mechanism and then designing inhibitors specific to that specific enzyme are a big business because of the potential to develop therapeutic pharmaceuticals. But it's not all just drugs. Also things like herbicides. What paid my salary for a while was Roundup, the broad spectrum herbicide. What it does is it inhibits an enzyme that's involved in the aromatic amino acid biosynthesis in plants. And so by spraying the glyphosate is the name of the molecule on a plant, it blocks aromatic amino acid biosynthesis in plants and kills the plant. Humans don't do aromatic amino acid biosynthesis. We get all our aromatic amino acids from our diet. So it has very low toxicity for humans. You can spray it on both sides and up and down the highways and all that. It doesn't hurt humans, but it kills the plants. And that's a pretty big business, that kind of thing. That's just one example of a herbicide. Another one are rodenticides. Glyphosate, Roundup. Rodenticides, this includes warfarin. Warfarin is a molecule that inhibits the blood, an enzyme in the blood, vitamin K reductase, which is important in the process of blood clotting. Okay, and so what the warfarin basically does is block the blood clotting. So warfarin is actually used as a human therapeutic in treating heart attacks, basically as an anticoagulant to keep clot forming in the carotid arteries. But it's also then used to kill rats and mice. That's basically what your decon is. When you get a little decon out there, it has this warfarin in there, and it is this enzyme involved in blood clotting. And what makes it kind of an effective rodenticide, it's not very nice, but what they do is the little critters, they start bleeding internally, and they get a lot of internal bleeding. And the nice thing about it, from a rodenticide perspective, is it makes them very thirsty, and they go outside to try to find something to drink, and so they die outside rather than dying inside the wall and taking out their house. I had when I lived in Washington State, I had this old house, and it had mice really bad. At first I was like setting the live traps out, and then taking them, setting them out there. And I got tired of that because it wasn't doing the job. And so then I was setting the old-fashioned traps and the old snap traps, And it was bad. Like I'd finish dinner, clean up the kitchen, set a couple of traps, and I'd be sitting in the living room, and then I'd hear whack, whack, and I'd go in there. I finally broke out the decon, and it did the job. Similar kind of thing, insecticides. Things like organophosphates that inhibit acetylcholinesterase, signal transduction in insect nerve systems. Those are enzyme inhibitors that basically work. And there's a differential sensitivity of insects relative to humans, although I'm not sure it's as differential as probably the insecticide appliers, which is like it can be kind of nasty. All right, so the main point is that this enzyme inhibition discussion isn't just sort of a philosophical discussion, but it's actually, there's a lot of applications for this. All right, so let's talk about different types of inhibition, and we can basically break them down in a couple of broad classes. Those that basically kill the enzyme forever, and those that reversibly bind to the enzyme, and then you actually, once you remove the inhibitor from the enzyme is happy. The first of these are known as irreversible inhibitors. So these chemically modify an enzyme to permanently inactivate it. And the best example, well-known example of this is aspirin. Aspirin, you guys maybe did this in there's a structure of aspirin. You maybe did this in organic chemistry, made aspirin. We do that in the lower division chemistry. I teach for the kinesiology majors. We make a little bit of aspirin. And the way aspirin works is this acetyl group. This acetyl group gets transferred to a serine in an enzyme involved in prostaglandin biosynthesis called cyclooxygenase. So we basically, we have the serine. Remember, the serine has side chain as CH2OH, as this alcohol here. The aspirin comes in. This acetyl group gets transferred you acetylate that serine. That serine is catalytically important. So this is a catalytically important residue. I'll call it catalytically essential. And if you remove the aspirin, if you dialyze away the aspirin, the serine stays acetylated and you're done. So sort of the way you recover from inhibiting the cyclooxygenase is your body just makes more cyclooxygenase. But that takes a little while. So basically when your aspirin is wearing off, what's happening is your body has, the cells have actually resynthesized more cyclooxygenase enzyme that's not acetylated to make it work. There's a whole kind of cool story about the history of aspirin and all that. I won't get into that detail. But that's just an example of an irreversible inhibitor. Yeah.
Do you think this is irreversible? Is there a way to actually make it active again?
Well, you probably could. Like if you had the enzyme in vitro and, I don't know, like if you tried to hydrolyze that ester, the classic conditions for hydrolyzing the ester in base conditions would probably denature the enzyme. So I think it would be tough to do without denaturing the enzyme.
But I would figure, like, when people take aspirin.
What's that?
I would figure when people take aspirin that they wear it out after a while.
Yeah. So what's wearing out is, what causes it to wear off is the body makes new cyclooxygenase enzyme that's not acetylated until it begins to regain its function.
Oh.
Yeah. Here, since I'm on the sidetrack anyway, people always talk about the acidity of aspirin and how it's hard in the stomach, and people, a long time this carboxyl group was basically blamed for this carboxyl group. But really why aspirin is hard on the stomach is because not only does it inhibit the synthesis of prostaglandins that are actually important for inflammation and pain, the kind of things that you want to do, but it also inhibits the formation of prostaglandins that are important for signaling the stomach to secrete mucus to protect it from the normal acidity of the stomach. And so for people who are suffering from arthritis and chronic pain, who would take heavy doses of aspirin all the time, you basically block the synthesis of the secretion of the mucus lining of the stomach, and it leads to stomach ulcers. But it's not really have anything to do with carboxyl group. It has to do with the fact that there are multiple roles of these prostaglandins, not just involved in inflammation and fever and these sorts of things. So it's tough to block just the ones involved in inflammation without blocking the other. All right. The other class is the reversible inhibitors. And in reversible inhibitors, we've got, again, some sort of subclass. Those are those that are involved in inhibiting at the active site, and those that are involved in binding away from the active site. So let's talk about inhibitors that bind at the active site. And these are known as competitive inhibitors. Competing with the substrate. To kind of show you how this works, I'm going to draw an enzyme kind of like this. This is my Pac-Man model of an enzyme, okay? Pac-Man was an early video game. This is the enzyme. And we might have a substrate that kind of fits into the active site. Here we spend all that time talking about protein structure, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary protein. All right. But then we might have an inhibitor that kind of has a similar shape that can also bind the substrate. So normally what would happen is you would basically form your enzyme substrate complex, and then you would go on to form your enzyme plus product. But what happens instead is the enzyme can also bind this inhibitor, and when the inhibitors bind, the substrate can't bind. All right, that's sort of a diagrammatic representation, basically, of this model here, which is E plus S, goes to ES, or we can also go, we can bring in I, we can go to EI, and go to ES. And so we can define a Ki that equals EI over EI. Oops. Now remember our Km, let's see if I go ahead and put these guys here. Our Km equals K cat plus K minus 1 over K1, and when we make the assumption that K cat is much less than K minus 1, that it equals K minus 1 over K1, which basically means it more or less equals the dissociation constant. Now the reason for reminding all of that is that, so when we talk about trying to design a good competitive inhibitor, we basically want a competitive inhibitor that has a Ki that is much lower than the Km. Again, a Ki, just like Km, we talked about sort of the measuring of the binding affinity for the substrate, so that if it's a Km is in the nanomolar range, it's really tight binding. If it's in the micromolar range, it's okay. If it's millimolar, it's kind of poor, right? If we want to design a really good inhibitor, we want a Ki significantly less than Km. So we basically desire Ki to be less than Km. You want it to work at very low concentration. So if you're in a drug development group and you're trying to come up with a compound that's going to inhibit an enzyme involved in the disease process, you're trying to basically find a molecule in which the Ki is much less than Km. Now, yeah.
I would figure you'll want your Ki to be, better, bigger.
So this is a common area. Remember that because these are dissociation constants, the lower the number, the better the binding. Lower the number, the better the binding. That's a common area of confusion. So you want a Ki in the nanomolar region if your Km is in the micromolar region. Micromolar is a typical kind of Km. You want your Ki down in the nanomolar region. That means you only need nanomolar concentrations to be able to actually start finding your enzyme. Where if your Km is in micromolar, then you need micromolar. So now this cuts back to our discussion about enzyme mechanism and transition state law analog. So one of the things that we talked about when we talked about our enzyme mechanism in the transition state is that, remember we talked about preferential binding in the transition state, that one of the enzyme mechanisms was the enzyme's ability to better bind the transition state than to bind the substrate itself. So if you're trying to find an inhibitor of an enzyme that binds better than the substrate binding being measured by Km, you're going to design your inhibitor to look like the transition state rather than necessarily look like the substrate. So that's a common thing, is to understand the mechanism, understand what the transition state is, and then try to design a molecule that best mimics the transition state. Because it's likely to be able to bind the enzyme with greater affinity than the substrate. All that is called rational drug design. Now there's another sort of philosophy towards drug design, and that's sort of the screening approach. And that is to take your target, your enzyme target that you want to inhibit to stop this disease process, and then you just have a library of thousands of molecules, and you just screen the molecules, and you say, I don't know what's going to work. I'm just going to go and libraries of, natural product libraries, all the big drug companies will have these, hundreds of thousands of different molecules, basically, in a library, and you set up robotics with 96 well or 256 well plates, basically, and try to run enzyme assays. You just kind of blindly screen through hundreds of thousands of different compounds to try to find one that blocks your enzyme. And they're sort of the competing, I don't know, against the philosophy, the screening approach versus the rational drug design approach. And then there's sort of the combination, which is combinatorial chemistry. You say, well, I think my molecule might need to look like this, but I don't know exactly what functional groups or what methyl groups or whatever I need to add to really make it work best. So I'm going to develop a combinatorial chemistry approach in which I can maybe synthesize a few hundred at least, or compounds at one time using combinatorial chemistry, and then I'll screen all 100 of those compounds for the ability. That's kind of the compromise strategy. All right, I'm getting all sidetracked here. All right, so we've got that's competitive inhibitors that bind at the active site. Now let's talk about inhibitors that bind away from the active site. Okay, so kinetically, what actually happens with this here is that a competitive inhibitor will end up increasing apparent Km and have no effect on Vmax. Get that down, we'll kind of talk about that, why that is. So Vmax, again, is Kcat times when all our enzyme is forced over this enzyme substrate complex. And what happens when you have an inhibitor in this solution, so actually without an inhibitor, as you add more substrate, you force the equilibrium of this to the right, you get until basically all your enzyme is forced over here to the right, and that's when you're at Vmax, right? And so you get towards Vmax by just adding more and more substrate. Now, if you have an inhibitor there, now you're actually having to compete with the inhibitor for the enzyme. But if you keep adding more substrate, you will eventually outcompete the inhibitor. But it's going to require a lot more substrate to actually get everything over here, because not only do you have to force this equilibrium to the right here, but you actually have to outcompete for this inhibitor. So it takes more substrate to actually shift this all the way to the right. But eventually you get there, and then so eventually you get your maximal activity. So our apparent Km is the amount of substrate it basically takes to start shifting this to the right, and it's just going to be higher in the presence of an inhibitor. But ultimately we'll get there. We'll get to that Vmax. So it increases apparent Km and no effect on Vmax. So what does that do to my favorite double reciprocal plot? Well, let's do it actually this one straight. Here's our initial velocity, here's our substrate concentration, and here's our no inhibitor situation. Here's Tmax. Here's Km. And so this is no inhibitor. Now when we add the inhibitor in there, what's going to happen is it's just going to take more substrate to get to Vmax, but you're going to get there eventually. So this is with inhibitor. Our apparent Km now is going to be shifted over here. So this is the apparent Km with the inhibitor. These are supposed to be nice, smooth curves. All right, now let's go to my favorite double reciprocal plot. Here's our no inhibitor. And this is 1 over V0. This is 1 over S. No inhibitor. Again, this is 1 over Vmax, and this is minus 1 over Km. All right, so now we say, what's going to happen with when we have an inhibitor in there? Well, we say Vmax has no effect. So 1 over Vmax, so we know that with the inhibitor, the line's going to go through here. It's still going to go through there. But we also say our apparent Km goes up. And here's where you have to do a little bit of sort of mental gyration. So this is minus 1 over Km. If Km goes up, okay, but it's minus here, what ends up happening is this line ends up going like this. So this ends up becoming minus 1 over Km with inhibitor. So this line here is with inhibitor. And as you add more and more inhibitor, that line just gets steeper and steeper and steeper. Your current Km goes up. All right. What am I going to do? I got my... Now we'll go back to these enzymes that bind away from the active site. Again, I'm going to give my little Pac-Man model, but I'm going to kind of throw in another little binding site. So we have our substrate binding site, and now we have our inhibitor binding site. And so now our inhibitor looks like this. Of course, we've got a substrate that looks like this. Now, when the inhibitor binds here, molecule to basically make the enzyme less effective as a catalyst. So inhibitor binding changes shape of the enzyme, reducing its ability to catalyze the reaction. Now, both of these may, the substrate actually might bind either the uninhibited or the complex, and the inhibitor also might bind the enzyme after it's bound substrate. Then ultimately, the only thing that's going to move forward is this uninhibited enzyme. All right, what I think I'm going to do is go ahead and what we'll do on Wednesday is we'll come in and just redraw that model real quick and then kind of go in and talk about the kinetic analysis of the